So let's talk now about Rudy Giuliani. He seemed to contradict himself yesterday when he sat down on the Sunday shows and said that President Trump and former FBI Director James Comey never talked about former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. But Giuliani and other Trump officials have indicated always in the past that the president did discuss Flynn with Comey. This is what Giuliani said yesterday, followed by comments he made last month.
What happened in that conversation with Comey about Michael Flynn? What exactly did President Trump say?
There was no conversation about Michael Flynn.
So you're saying that President Trump and James Comey never discussed Michael Flynn?
That is what he will testify to if he's asked that question. They already know that. So why are they asking us for him to repeat what they already know under oath?
And you're also saying that a month ago you didn't tell ABC News that he said something along the lines of can you give him a break?
No, I did not. I said that is what Comey says. The reality is Comey, in some ways, ends up being a good witness for us.
How is he a good witness for the president if he's saying that the president was asking him, directing him, in his words, to let the Michael Flynn investigation go?
He didn't direct him to do that. What he said to him was, can you give him a break?
Comey says he...
So, John Heilman, what are we to make of that? Is Rudy Giuliani making up as he goes along? Is he purposely lying? Does he have early onset of dementia? How does he go from yesterday saying he never asked that question to us, of course, having a tape where just clearly a couple of weeks ago he said that's precisely what the president said?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to rule out early onset, but the first option seems to me obviously the right one. I mean, Giuliani, as I said before, his credibility is basically zero on pretty much everything at this point because he's contradicted himself over and over and over again. But we are now veering into a new terrain in terms of the kind of deception that they're trying to perpetrate and that he's trying to perpetrate in this context. It is not just the case that this is not a question of Jim Comey's word versus Donald Trump's word, Jim Comey's word today versus Rudy Giuliani's version of Donald Trump's reality today. You have Jim Comey's contemporaneous notes from the time. You have contemporaneous notes of other people that Jim Comey reported the conversation to at the time. You have people, every account of this that's been given by everyone, including many people who are allies of the president, suggest that conversation did take place. There's lots of dispute around the details, around what did Trump intend, around what did he mean, around what did he know about the state of the Flynn investigation at that moment. Many of those things are in dispute. What has never been in dispute until this weekend was the notion that the question of Mike Flynn came up in the room with Jim Comey. And all that is now happening is Rudy Giuliani is pushing a sustained campaign of gaslighting the country and blatant fabrication with a political end to its logical, and obviously what I mean by logical, I mean insane extreme, to the point where he's getting tripped up on words of his own from just a fortnight ago.
Yeah, and I mean, again, John Meacham, we can go through Jim Comey's contemporaneous notes and his friend's contemporaneous notes, or you can just take Rudy Giuliani's word for it, because Giuliani himself said the president was saying, give Flynn a break. I mean, you could say this is the death of truth. I think this is just the renaissance of just stupid, out and out stupid in the no false
binaries here, Joe. Those can both be true.
I mean, seriously, it's a third grader, and I've had 4 third graders. A third grader would be able to keep his or her story more consistent than what Rudy Giuliani's doing out on the Sunday shows every morning.
If Barbara Tuchman were alive, we would now have the title for her book about the age of Trump, The Renaissance of Stupid. I love it. I think it's perfect. One of the things, the thing that struck me with this Giuliani bit over the weekend was, you know, so far we have that wonderfully rich vernacular from Watergate, twisting slowly in the wind, a third-rate burglary, expletive deleted. One of the great entries in the Trump version of that is, Lordy, I hope there are tapes. And so partly on this one, it's Are you going to believe James Comey, who's kind of the Samuel Pepys, right? He's an obsessive diarist. Or are you going to believe Donald Trump, who's already admitted to obstruction to Lester Holt without being subpoenaed? So we can leave that aside for a second. It seems to me, as John was just saying, that this is setting up a kind of political Armageddon, almost a cultural Armageddon. And I don't mean to be wildly hyperbolic at this hour on a Monday.
No, please,
but
please.
There is this question. Since you already used Renaissance, I'll use Armageddon. It seems to me that what the goal here has to be wounding every possible vehicle that would bring any contrary fact to the table. And so at this point, if you obfuscate, if you have 83% of Republicans thinking that the way Donald Trump handles race in America, even on a tonal basis, let's leave aside the substance side, if you have 83% of those Republicans thinking that, you're going to have an equal or higher number, it seems to me, willing to believe what Trump or his lawyers say about the FBI or the deep state or whatever. So we have this moment where we really are going to have to decide, are facts stubborn things, as John Adams said? Do we actually care about what genuinely happened as opposed to what a president that somebody likes says happened? And that's a really important inflection point in the life of the Republic. Nixon, people were willing at the very end to turn on Nixon. Now, they had him on tape. They had him on tape so they could hear it. So maybe that's a difference. I don't know, but it's a fascinating moment. And why does this always happen in August?
Why does it always happen in August? But it always does. Casey Hunt, it is becoming more and more obvious. Of course, Donald Trump. Again, all you have to do is listen to what he said to Lester Holt and the Russian foreign minister and the Russian ambassador to the United States to figure out that he fired Comey to end the Russian investigation. Even White House press admitted as much. He wanted to end the Russian investigation. But even on the other side of this, for Republicans staring at the facts, and you look at the indictments of the 12 Russians that work for the GRU, and it becomes very obvious with the forensic evidence, it becomes very obvious that Vladimir Putin and Russia were trying to undermine U.S. democracy. And, Tom Nichols, who's not only a professor, but also writes for The Federalist, and he's a Twitter extraordinaire, a tweeter extraordinaire, said this past weekend, and I think a lot of Republicans are starting to get there, saying, hey, listen, there is no question anymore that members of Trump's team were trying to coordinate with the Russian government to influence the outcome of the campaign. The only question is, what did the president know? How much did he know? And when did he know it? Aren't the facts in this week by week falling in such a way that even for the most steadfast Trump ally on Capitol Hill, even if they're parroting him, there's not much of a question left that something was going on between Trump's team and the Russian government, and it wasn't good.
I'm not sure the most steadfast Trump allies on Capitol Hill are ever going to move, but I think that your larger point is correct, and the reality is that we are heading for a reckoning. And that is, right now, every Republican on Capitol Hill can answer the question by saying, let Mueller do his job. We want to see the results of this. But the way that the president's team is setting this up, they are, as you saw with Rudy Giuliani, trying to provide their own set of facts, their own narrative, their own way for Republicans to defend them. And every single person on Capitol Hill is at some point going to have to choose not only who do they believe, but who are they going to stand with. And I think, John Meacham knows how our republic was originally founded, the idea that, we send elected representatives to be wiser than the group of people who sent them there to make tough decisions when those decisions needed to be made at the potential expense of losing their elections. And that's going to be the stakes for everybody.
It's interesting, Lindsey Graham, watching how Lindsey Graham's handling this in South Carolina. Lindsey will say, and he's said it to the president, he's also said it to people in town hall meetings in South Carolina, let Mueller finish his job. and then he'll throw some other red meat out to the left, throw some other red meat out to the right, talk about Hillary Clinton. But at the same time, it's maybe jab the FBI a little bit. But at his core, Lindsey Graham is one of those representatives that, at least so far on Mueller, is doing the right thing, saying, let the investigation go where it needs to go. And he explains politically, if the Republicans were not to do that, we would have a real constitutional crisis. And John Heilman, I've given up. I guess I could say this about politicians on both sides of the aisle, but with my Republican brothers and sisters, I've given up thinking that they're going to stand up and show remarkable courage. Maybe even saying we have to keep Mueller is just a realization that there would be a meltdown, a political meltdown of epic proportions if they allowed Donald Trump to take the last step in obstructing justice and firing Bob Mueller.
Well, I think that's right. There's no evidence of any kind of political courage on the part of Republicans that's been evident in the course of the last 18 months. I think the only thing at this point, Joe, that is going to matter, because it's the only thing that has mattered so far, has been what the electoral calculus is for Republicans on Capitol Hill. They at this moment, they have behaved for 18 months, despite everything the president's done. And I'm not just talking about like all the various things that we find kind of appalling about his behavior, but the ways in which he's departed from Republican orthodoxy and has departed from Republican policy, except on a couple of big things like tax cuts and the Supreme Court. They have stuck with him because they're afraid of his base, because they're afraid that the political damage inflicted on them if they deviate from him will be too high. So the only question now is what happens in November, and what does the calculus look like for the members of your former party after the midterm elections and the results are in? And if Democrats have taken back control of the House and maybe the Senate, that calculus will change. How much it will change, we don't know. But the math they're doing will be different when it looks like sticking with Donald Trump might be more costly than breaking with Donald Trump. They just will be a different math problem for them. But let's be clear, it's going to be a math problem and not a problem in which, not a calculation in which patriotism, values, ideological consistency, history, any of that matters. It's just going to be all about self-preservation.
Our courage. You're exactly right, John. And we're going to continue talking about this over the next couple of hours. But thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube. And make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.